Classical liberalism was, say, in Wilhelm von Humboldt, parts of Rousseau, Rousseau's Second Discourse, other Enlightenment conceptions, actually goes all the way back to Descartes. It was committed to a conception of human nature as being based on unconstrained creative activity. So, for example, say for Humboldt, one of the founders of classical liberalism, also the modern education system, also linguistics, in fact, his basic picture was summarized in a phrase in which he said that if a craftsman produces a beautiful work on command, we may admire what he does, but we'll despise what he is, a tool in the hands of others. If the craftsman creates out of his own interest, initiative, commitment, search, then we admire what he is. And the same with a child. If a child is treated like, say in the schools, like a vessel into which you pour water, maybe the water will come out again in the right form, but it's not education. What the teacher ought to be doing is, Humboldt's phrase, laying out a thread along which the student progresses in his or her own way from inner impulses. And that relates immediately to social organization. Follows right away that any acceptable, decent form of social organization ought to be based on, ought to nurture and encourage free creative activity, and that includes self-determination, control of all the decisions that matter in the institution. So it's a kind of like a seamless web, and out of that comes classical liberalism, and as Rudolf Rocker, an anarchist thinker, pointed out, I think pretty accurately, classical liberalism foundered on the shoals of capitalism. When this is pre-capitalist, and when capitalist structures developed, classical liberalism was destroyed. It couldn't, its own conceptions of freedom, independence, and creativity were stunted or destroyed by the hierarchical managerial structure that was a core of capitalist institutions. And anarchism then would be from this point of view, would be the development of the remnants of classical liberalism and conversion of them into ways of thinking and acting in a capitalist or post-capitalist society. Anarcho-syndicalism specifically was directed towards organization of industrial societies. So I think there's a continuity that goes through. The term neoliberalism is a very curious one. First of all, it's not liberal by any means, as we've discussed, and it's not new. It was neoliberal policies, or something rather like them, that created the Third World. If you go back to, say, the 18th century, the centers of the world economy were China, India, mostly, and it changed. The differences between the rich and the poor were not very great, nowhere near like today. Europe grew and developed, first England and the United States, Germany, Italy, and so on. They developed by radically violating what are now called neoliberal principles, strong states, direct intervention in the economy, and so on. India and later China were devastated, and the same is true of what we now call the Third World. How? By forced imposition of market principles. And this is furthermore well known. So if you read serious economic historians, Paul Bayroche, for example, he simply points out protectionism and state intervention created the rich and developed societies. He doesn't call it neoliberalism, but forced liberalization pretty much created the Third World. It's rather striking to see how every element of the neoliberal package is specifically designed to undercut democracy. It's rarely discussed, and people talk about its economic effects. But just think it through. Let's take, say, financial liberalization, core. For Keynes, the greatest achievement of the Bretton Woods system, post-war system, was to institute financial regulation. And there's a reason. That provides space for governments to undertake programs that are supported by the population. If you have no constraints on capital flow, then you can attack currencies freely. Now that creates what international economists sometimes call a virtual parliament of investors and lenders who can, I'm quoting from technical literature, it can carry out a moment-by-moment referendum on government policies. And if they think the policies are irrational, they can vote against them by capital flight or by attacks on the currencies and so on. The policies that are irrational are, by definition, those that benefit people but don't improve profit and market access and so on. And therefore governments face what's called a dual constituency, their own population and the virtual parliament. And the virtual parliament usually wins, especially in poor countries. The rich countries sort of, it was modulated, you know, first of all, they didn't accept the neoliberal package as completely as, say, Latin America, but to the extent that they did, the effects are predictable. And the same is true of other elements of the neoliberal programs. So take, say, privatization, which became a mantra. Well, by definition, privatization undercuts democracy, takes something out of the public arena and puts it into the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies that are created and supported by the state, which is what corporations are.
Some people are describing the kinds of energies that are going into the Sanders campaign as part of a global phenomenon, right? So that we have Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, another self-described socialist who's now the head of the Labour Party in Britain, and in Greece, which has been burdened so traumatically by austerity policy. We have Alexis Tsipras of the left-wing Syriza party, who's been elected prime minister. And I was curious as to what you thought was the, if something is shared behind these candidacies, if something more universal is driving the kind of enthusiasm for the left in this moment.
Not just this moment. There's something very common. It's called neoliberalism. This is a general assault on the world's population that's Talk about the liberal media, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, for one thing, the media have if you want to say the media are liberal, I can't disagree. I mean, so the journalists tend to support women's choice? Yeah, probably. Do they believe in civil rights? Yeah, probably. But that has almost nothing to do with the content of the media. If you want to, I've written a lot about the media, but I've never talked about liberal conservative bias, but I don't think it means anything. You want to understand the media, first of all, take a look at their content. Okay, I gave one example before, the propaganda, fantastic propaganda, which managed to convince people of these incredible delusions about Iraq. It's not that the media came out and said Saddam Hussein was responsible for 9/11, but they permitted distribution of those charges uncritically in such a way that the population actually came to believe it. And there's case after case of this. Before this, earlier in the program, I mentioned that you can't find a map in the media of the Clinton-Barack offers of a settlement in Camp David, which was so highly praised. Well, I don't know if that's liberal bias or conservative bias, but it's not a journalistic integrity. If you want people to understand what this proposal was, show them a map. That's the way to decide what it was. And that was withheld. And there's case after case of this. I think there's enormous documentation of the fact, you can check it if you like, that the choice of topics, the shaping of information, the basic assumptions and so on fall within a fairly narrow spectrum, which tend to be highly supportive of state and corporate power. I don't think it's either liberal or conservative, it's just the way things work. Some of my favorite newspapers are called very conservative, like the news reporting in the Wall Street Journal is as good as any I know, maybe better, and it's supposed to be a conservative journal. But the question is, what is the media product? And then, if you want to understand it, you don't look at liberal and conservative, whatever they mean. You look at the institutional roots. What kind of institutions are the media? Well, turns out they're major corporations tied in with even bigger ones. Their income comes from other businesses, namely advertisers. They're basically selling a product, namely audiences, to other businesses. And I think if you look, you find that the interests and concerns of the sellers and the buyers have a very powerful influence on the media product. That has to be demonstrated, not just asserted. But that's my opinion, and as I say, I and others have written a lot about it, but I don't think it has anything to do with liberal and conservative bias.
Well, to take the second question, there certainly are alternatives to neoliberal policies. In fact, we've had them in our own history. So take the what's commonly called the golden age of modern capitalism, should be state capitalism, 1950s and the 1960s. Was a regulated, there were no financial crises for a very simple reason. First of all, banks were banks, not speculative investment firms. Secondly, they were regulated under New Deal regulations. So therefore, they functioned within the substantive economy, the actual economy, and there are no crises. We know how to deal with that the same way. Financial transaction tax could radically cut back the predatory behavior of the huge financial institutions. It's a straightforward proposal. There are perfectly possible programs that can be implemented that are radically opposed to the neoliberal programs that in fact would change the country. So let's be concrete. The 2008 crisis, one of the effects was that the government, Obama, essentially nationalized the auto industry. It's a major industry. It was essentially in the hands of the government. The taxpayer bailed it out. There were choices. One choice was the neoliberal choice. Let's bail it out. Public will bail it out. hand it back over to the same owners, maybe different faces, but the same banks, the same class, and so on, and have it continue to produce automobiles. That was one choice. There were other possible choices. One possible alternative was hand it over to the workforce and the community, let them run it, and let them produce what the country needs, which is not more traffic jams, but rational mass transportation. That was a choice. And in fact, right down the line, there's choice after choice. I didn't